Welcome back to The Exorcist Files, the podcast which encourages you to hold fast to what is good. I'm your co-host Ryan Bethay, but today you get a gift, a reprieve. We are excited to bring you a special Lenten audio retreat provided by the one and the only Father Carlos Martins. It's part of a series we will be rolling out over the next few weeks. But fear not, we will have more dramatic case files for you in the coming months. Don't you worry. I also want to say, before we start the show, that I know we have listeners from all walks and all backgrounds. Not everyone observes Lent, but from my own experience, I have found that setting aside time to pray, committing to do something intentional for a period of time to seek God has always led to fruit and unexpected blessings in my life. In fact, each time I wrap up a week of prayer or fasting or a period of intentional study or seeking, I always end with, why don't I do that more often? That was amazing. So with that, Father Martins and I hope you'll consider joining Hallow's annual prayer challenge, Prayer 40, The Return. You can join Jonathan Rumi, or Jesus as many of you know him from The Chosen, Father Mike Schmitz, Chris Pratt, and Mark Wahlberg. It starts today and it continues through Easter. So download Hallow and join Lent Prayer 40 by going to hallow.com/xfiles. That's EXFiles, hallow.com/xfiles. I don't know what will happen after the 40 days, but it'll probably be a big blessing. And with that, here's Father Martins.
Welcome, friends, to our Lenten reflection, our Lenten retreat, Day 1, Jesus and Pontius Pilate. And I want to begin this reflection, which this is the first in a series that is meant to draw us deeper into the Christian message. Lent is a time for us to begin again, to start over again and to reflect. And I know that many people who listen to the show are not Christians. And I wanted to do this series to give people a chance to enter into a spiritual dimension of Christianity. And I thought the season of Lent, there's no better time to do this. So more than a teaching, this is a reflection, a meditation on what I believe is the heart of the Christian message, and it reveals itself during Jesus's, what I call his Lenten conversations. And the first one is with Jesus and Pontius Pilate. And I want to begin this episode kind of like from left field. I want to talk about prisons. In the start of my priesthood, I did a lot of prison ministry, and I visited, essentially maximum security prisons. I did that because they get so few priests coming in, and they never turn down an opportunity, at least in my experience. And so a prison is a brutal place where law is kept by might. The men in a prison are there because they've done terrible things. They're there for a reason. And although no two prisons are exactly alike, there are common characteristics. So there is always an intense discipline exerted on the inmates in order to keep order. So those who are in a prison, and especially a maximum security prison, they're under a constant tension. And you see that in them. And I mean, in one sense, how could they not, right? They're grossly understimulated. They're bored to death. They have virtually nothing to look forward to. They do the same routine every day after day. And to manage that tension, the warden oversees an exacting management. So, for example, most prisons I've been to, in the corridors, they have 3 lanes. So you have essentially a corridor. There are 3 walking lanes. So on the far right, that's your lane. When you're walking, you stick to the right side of the corridor. The left side of the corridor, the far lane, the farthest from you, is for traffic going in the opposite direction. And then the lane in the middle, which is much wider than the other 2, it's essentially twice as wide as the other 2 lanes, those are for prison guards, guests, the warden, visitors, chaplains, priests, etc. no inmate is ever permitted in that lane. And if you step your foot even on the line, there's an immediate retribution by a guard, and your life will be very difficult for at least for the rest of that day. And so the prison authorities have this uncompromising and severe discipline, and you immediately sense that when you go into the prison. I remember the first prison I went to, when I pulled into the parking lot and I pulled off the highway, and I drove through a very long packed dirt road. And then, the first thing you see is the tower with the tower guard there. And when he saw me pull up, he came out with a machine gun in his hands, and he held it up to make sure that I saw what he had. In other words, you're not going to try anything. He didn't know who I was or what I was from his, but he wanted me to know that this is what we've got here. And so when you first go to a prison, you see that authority, and who wields it is the warden. When a warden rules with the power of a king. Within the prison, there's no higher authority. When he exercises his authority, it is followed by all. So the first time I went to a death row prison, the warden pulled me aside and he said to me, "Father, we're glad that you're here. We're grateful that you're here, but I don't want you to go any closer than 6 feet to a pod." Now, a pod is what they call a cell for an inmate on death row. So an average prisoner, he's in a cell. A death row inmate, he's in a pod. A pod has no windows. There's a slit from which he can observe whether it's daytime or nighttime. That's his only exposure to the outside. He can't actually see anything outside. The door is a solid door, and there's a grated slit, maybe 2 inches by 8 inches, from which he can peer out into the corridor. So the warden told me, "Father, I don't want you to go any closer than 6 feet to the pod door. And in fact, I'm going to have you wear a flak jacket." So a flak jacket is a heavy protective jacket, so that if a projectile is thrown at you or kind of like if there's anything that you're stabbed with, it will protect you. And of course, you're thinking the way I was thinking at the time, I'm sure, why in heaven's name would I need a flak jacket in the main corridor of a prison? Well, the inmates, they manage to get things that they shouldn't have inside their cells, even in a death row. And so this warden told me this story because he saw the puzzled look on my face. He told me the story of why they have these kinds of policies. And so he told me that within his prison, so this is Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. He told me the story of a volunteer who was with the Salvation Army Church, and he had, over the course of months, and in fact, I think it was a couple of years, he had built up this relationship with one of the inmates who was on death row. And one day that inmate called him over and said that he had made a bracelet for the volunteer. And, the man was touched and thankful, and he reached out for it. But the inmate said, it would mean a lot to me if I could put it on your wrist myself. And so the man put his wrist through the small, narrow opening behind the door. So in most death row prisons, most prisons for that matter, the cell doors or the pod doors, they don't swing. They're not on hinges. They move left to right or right to left. They swing. They're controlled electronically so that there's no swinging motion. They just proceed back and forth. And so the only way that this bracelet could be put on, there's no room through the slit in the door. The man had to put his arm, he had to wiggle it through the very narrow opening so that his arm was now inside the cell. Well, what the inmate did, he had a rope, he had tied the rope into a noose, and he put it around the wrist of that volunteer. And the other end of the rope, he tied it to the sink in his pod. And then he grabbed a piece of steel and he started to hack away at the guy's arm. And of course, there's screaming and there's commotion and the guards come. And of course, they're trying to open up this door to stop this from happening. But because the door doesn't swing, because the door just moves on a track back and forth, the volunteer's very body was stopping that movement from happening. Right? His own body was blocking the movement of the door. So it took a while. It took some minutes to get that door open. By the time that got it open, his arm was almost hacked right off his body. So inmates, they're in prison for a reason. And if they're in a maximum security prison, if they're on a death row, they have done some pretty horrible stuff. Pontius Pilate, you could say, was a warden. His job as the Roman governor was to keep order in Roman-occupied Israel, to keep order in a place that was under tremendous tension. The people of Israel, the Jews, were enormously passionate about their religion, and they greatly resented the Romans who had conquered them. Of all the nations and peoples conquered by Rome, and there was a great many of them, the Jews were easily the people who most resented the Roman overlords, the Roman occupiers. The Jews believed that only one ruler was over them, and that is God. They also believed that one day God would send his Messiah, the Christ, to establish and rule a divine kingdom. So Jerusalem today, the old city of Jerusalem, is roughly 1/3 of a square mile. 1/3 of a square mile. That's it. During the time of Jesus, it was half the area it is today. So 1/6 of a square mile. So this is, we're not talking about a very big area. In fact, when you travel to Jerusalem, it is very possible to walk up and down every street in an afternoon, no problem. And the population of Jerusalem was somewhere around 25,000 to 50,000 people during the time of Jesus. Right? But during Passover, the city of Jerusalem could swell to over 500,000 or even 1 million people. Right? So that is just an incredible amount of people in a small place, in the confines of a small surface area. So this is the background that I think is going to allow us to understand the kind of mindset that Pontius Pilate had, to kind of get inside his head during that conversation that Jesus had with Pontius Pilate, otherwise known as the trial of Jesus before Pilate. And the biblical account of that trial is long. In the Gospel of John gives the fullest account, and John devotes 28 verses to it. And that's lengthy. It crosses over 2 chapters. And it makes the trial of Jesus among the central issues within John's Gospel. So I'm going to read that for you right now. And of course, if you've got your Bibles, and I certainly recommend, if you don't, get it in front of you. I'm going to read from the translation of the New American Bible, Revised Edition, but really any edition is fine. And I'm beginning at John chapter 18, verse 28. Then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was morning. And they themselves did not enter the praetorium in order not to be defiled, so that they could eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." At this, Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews answered him, "We do not have the right to execute anyone," in order that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled that he said, indicating the kind of death he would die. So Pilate went back into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this on your own, or have others told you about me?" Pilate answered, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here. So Pilate said to him, Then you are a king. Jesus answered, You say I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice.
Recently, I've been going through my Bible and reading 1 Samuel, studying up on old King David. In chapter 26, we read of a deep sleep that fell over King Saul and his camp, a sleep that was so deep it allowed David and his companion to enter into the camp and steal away with Saul's jug of water and his spear, signifying the end of his reign. While this was a win for David, I did find myself envying King Saul, who apparently was having a great night's sleep, and he didn't even have blissy silk pillowcases to help him. But we do. Look, sleep is so important. You hear it all the time. And honestly, the older I get, the more grateful I am for a good night's sleep. It affects so much of your health, your mind, and shockingly, even your skin. You've heard the phrase silky smooth. I don't know who came up with that, but they were absolutely right. Silk is the best. It's beyond comfortable, and it keeps you cool. And just like the kids said to me on the playground all those years ago, Ryan, you want to be cool, right? Yes, I do want to be cool. They also make an awesome sleep mask. It's comfortable, and I bring it with me on all my travels. I fly a lot. And while we all wear masks metaphorically, I actually wear a mask almost all the time. A lot of people don't think about their pillowcases, but where you lay your head down does make a difference for sleep. There's no guarantees of a good night's sleep, but why not stack the deck in your favor and optimize everything you can, including your pillowcase? Now, as I say in the show, you should never just listen to me. But with over 3 million sold, there are a lot of people staying cool. And Blissy's been featured in Vogue, Oprah Daily, Good Morning America, and they've won numerous awards. Because you're a listener of The X-Files, Blissy is offering 60 nights risk-free plus an additional 30% off when you shop at blissy.com/xfiles. That's BLISSY.com/xfiles, EXFiles, and use our code to get an additional 30% off. Your skin and your hair will thank you. Sleep well, y'all.
Pilate said to him, What is truth? When he had said this, he again went out to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I released one prisoner for you at Passover. Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? They cried out again, Not this one, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him scourged. And the soldiers wove a crown out of thorns and placed it on his head, and clothed him in a purple cloak. And they came to him and said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him repeatedly. Once more Pilate went out and said to them, Look, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple cloak. And he said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the guards saw him, they cried out, Crucify him. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered, We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Now when Pilate heard this statement, he became even more afraid, and went back to the praetorium and said to Jesus, Where are you from? Jesus did not answer him. So Pilate said to him, Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you, and I have power to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above. For this reason, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. Consequently, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release him, you are not a friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and seated him on the judge's bench in the place called Stone Pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was preparation day for Passover, and it was about noon. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So Pilate's first question to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So it's interesting. He doesn't ask if Jesus is a king, but whether he is the king of the Jews. You see, if Pilate were asking him if Jesus was merely a king, it would be the same as asking, are you seeking land, money, power, the kind of stuff that earthly kings seek? But it is significant that he asked Jesus if he is the king of the Jews, because that king, the king of the Jews, is the one who the scriptures say lives in glory. So that king is defined. And that occurs, that definition, is in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. As the visions during the night continued, I saw coming with the clouds of heaven one like a son of man. When he reached the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, he received dominion, splendor, and kingship. All nations, peoples, and tongues will serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. His kingship one that shall not be destroyed. If you already live in glory, then you lack nothing, and you have no need of the stuff that the kings of this world are worried about: money, land, power, etc. Pilate asks Jesus if he is this second king, this king for whom the Jews have been waiting. By this, Pilate reveals that Jesus isn't a political threat to him. His kingdom is not of this world. But then again, maybe Jesus is a threat, a different kind of threat. We know that everyone whom Jesus encountered, their lives changed. They became disciples and they began to live in a different manner. But Pilate merely poses this question to Jesus and adds nothing else. Are you the king of the Jews? But Jesus calls his bluff and raises him. He says to him, do you say this on your own, or have others told you about me? Jesus answers the question by asking a question. Pilate, have others told you about me being the Messiah, or have my words and actions reached your heart and unlocked part of it? Did you merely hear from others that I'm the Messiah, or is that a conclusion that you've already made for yourself? Have you heard about me and liked what you heard? Pilate had to know that many believed Jesus to be the Messiah. It was the news that had swept all of Judea. As the warden, it's his job to know the details, to know what people were thinking and doing, right? This is the time of Passover. There's going to be 500,000 to 1 million people in Jerusalem. It's packed, and the tension is through the roof. And if there's a rebellion, the Romans do not have anywhere near the amount of officers and soldiers to quell it. All right, so Pilate wants to head off any trouble at the pass and nip it right in the bud. Right? So Pilate would have had briefings on everything that is going on, right? He's got to know everything that's happening, and then he's got to decide on a course of action to meet whatever needs have arisen, right? So recall, for example, in Luke 7, that's where Jesus healed the servant of the centurion. The Roman centurion's servant was healed in Luke 7, right? So centurion is, of course, a Roman, and we know the story. He goes up to Jesus and he asks him to heal his servant, but he famously says, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Only say the word, and I know my servant will be healed." And so, incidentally, it was this centurion who built the Jewish temple, the synagogue, in Capernaum, Jesus' hometown, when he inaugurated his ministry. He made Capernaum his hometown. And in fact, you can go there today to Capernaum and see that very synagogue. You can see the ruins of it. Many of the walls are not there anymore. They're eroded, but certainly the floor is there. You can stand on the same floor that Jesus stood on. And 2,000 years later, friends, if we're talking about this Roman centurion and his synagogue, if 2,000 years later we're talking about this guy and what he gifted to the Jewish people of Capernaum, do you think it's likely that the news of that stuff didn't make it back to Pilate? I don't think it's very likely. But it's interesting the manner in which Jesus addresses the issue with Pilate. Jesus says, "Do you say this on your own, or have others told you about me?" In other words, this question about my kingship, is that coming from you, Pilate, or from others? You see, Pilate didn't include that part in his question. He didn't say something like, "I've heard a lot about you, Jesus." He remained silent, maybe coy, about what he knows regarding Jesus, about what he believes regarding Jesus. But how he phrases the question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And this phrasing shows that he has knowledge both of the prophesied Messiah and of Jesus. It shows he has an education in the Jewish religion. He knows exactly where to put his finger. He knows exactly what the Jews are expecting. He knows exactly the characteristics of the prophesied king. And he poses the question to Jesus, "Are you this guy about whom it is written?" Of course, Jesus knows that Pilate has heard about him. Jesus is God. He knows everything. He can't fail to know. But note how Jesus does not come right out and say to Pilate, "You do know about me. Testimony about me has reached your ears. I know it has. What do you think about what you've heard, Pilate?" Jesus doesn't do that. He is gentle with Pilate, right? But make no mistake, in his response, Jesus asks Pilate the question that he asks everybody: "Who do you say that I am?" Jesus' reply is a subtle asking of, who am I, Pilate? Without asking it at all. Jesus is supremely gentle with Pilate. He leaves Pilate to make a judgment himself about what he hears and gives them room to answer it. But he invites Pilate to do that very thing, to answer it, to share it. Pilate then asks Jesus a second question. What Jesus asks of Pilate hits home. It hits Pilate right in the soft spot. We know this because of that very response. "I'm not a Jew, am I?" You're not a Jew? What does that have to do with anything, Pilate? All Jesus asked you was whether you arrived at the conclusion that Jesus is the King of the Jews on your own or through the claims of others. Why are you all of a sudden so defensive, Pilate?
Have you ever been to someone's house and you open a cupboard and it resembles a pharmacy. Like you open a cabinet and set before you is this cornucopia of vitamins, supplements, and compounds you didn't even know were legal except back in the Soviet Union in the 80s. Look, I do take supplements, but for me, it's really important to do my homework and research and see what actually has evidence to suggest efficacy. And because of that, I actually choose to take colostrum, specifically cowboy colostrum. For example, there are some small trials and reviews that suggest colostrum can actually improve gut health and improve some gastrointestinal symptoms, likely via the immunoglobulins and growth factors. There's also several small human studies that indicate reduced intestinal permeability. If that sounds familiar, it's known as leaky gut in both healthy and clinical populations. And lastly, there's some very limited evidence, but some, that older adults may have increased leg strength and reduced bone resorption versus just taking whey protein when combined with resistance training. Now, none of this is guaranteed, and the evidence is still very preliminary. But for me, I take it every day, and I feel it makes a big difference. And seriously, like we always say on this show, go do your homework, research it, and decide if you think colostrum's right for you. Now, I like cowboy colostrum because it's 100% made in America from 100% American grass-fed cows to get you the best colostrum. Unlike other colostrum brands, cowboy colostrum is true first-day whole colostrum rich in bioactives like immunoglobulins and growth factors, same ones I mentioned earlier, and it comes in a variety of great flavors, so you can have lots of options for that smoothie. So if you want to give it a try, for a limited time, our listeners get up to 25% off their entire order. Just head to cowboycolostrum.com/xfiles, that's EXFiles, and use our code XFiles at checkout. That's 25% off when you use our code XFiles at cowboycolostrum.com/xfiles. Teeth matter. Did you know there are some studies that show keeping your teeth is associated with a ton of long-term health outcomes? In fact, go ask any one of the AI models about the connection between the integrity of your teeth and how it can affect you long-term. You might be surprised. The bottom line, we want to do what we can to ensure optimal health for our teeth. And if you grind your teeth, well, that can lead to issues long-term with enamel, fractures, and overall tooth integrity, which is not good. If you grind your teeth, you should consider a Remy custom night guard. 350,000 Americans have. Remy night guards are clinically tested and FDA cleared to prevent teeth damage from grinding, to reduce jaw tension and facial muscle strain, and to improve your sleep quality. You'll get the same professional quality and comfort as a night guard from the dentist for about 80% less of the cost by taking your own impression from the convenience of your home. So here's how it works. You purchase it, and then you get this impression kit, which comes straight to your door. Then you follow the step-by-step instructions to get your perfect impression. Remy crafts and ships you your custom-fit night guard. You get it back, and you start protecting your teeth. I went through the process, and it's really simple. And they send you this like Play-Doh stuff you get to bite into to make your impression. It's really cool. It gives new meaning to the phrase, make a good impression. So protect your teeth with Remy by using code XFiles, that's EXFiles, to get 50% off your new night guard. That's 50% off at shopremy.com/xfiles and use our code XFiles. Thank you, Remy, for sponsoring this episode.
Jesus' answer to Pilate is more than what Pilate was expecting. It was a challenge to him. And his response is equivalent to him saying, I shouldn't be expecting a Messiah, should I? That's a Jewish expectation, and so it doesn't apply to me, a Roman. Does it, Jesus? That am I on the end. I'm not a Jew, am I? Changes everything. It shows Pilate is not very confident in his position. It betrays his poker hand by revealing some of the cards he's holding. Right? Jesus has shaken him somewhat. We know that the news of Jesus, the good news, had reached Pilate in his head. But what Jesus is asking, what he's probing, is whether it's reached his heart as well. Pilate knows Jesus. He knows who he is, but he continues to sit on the fence regarding Jesus' identity by reminding Jesus that the Jews themselves have rejected him. And if your own people reject you, Jesus, if they're outside right now barking for your death, how can I be expected to follow you? How can I be expected to accept you as my king? Pilate is searching. You see it, right? He's not rejected Jesus. He knows that Jesus is different. He already knows that Jesus is not a political enemy. He knows Jesus has not been violent. He's not willfully caused any trouble. But what worries Pilate is that Jesus' own people are rejecting him. It's as if he's saying to Jesus that the very blood that prophesied your coming and spoke about your greatness is now screaming for your blood. Maybe it's even more than that. Maybe it's also the fact that if Jesus is a king, Pilate knows that he's going to have to change. He will have to define himself by this new king. So Pilate asks the third question. He's processing. And in that processing comes out this: what have you done? In other words, what have you done to make your own people turn against you so much? This is really the same as Pilate asking Jesus, if you are a king, why don't I see more evidence of your kingdom? If the salvation you preach is for everyone, even for me, why is this world still the crummy mess that it is? Why is Judea, why is Jerusalem the same god-awful place that it's always been since I've arrived here? Even among your own people, you are being rejected. In other words, I want more proof, Jesus, that you are for real. But Jesus has provided the proof. The fact that Pilate, the warden, is talking to a common criminal is already proof that he believes that Jesus is profoundly different. He believes he must speak to Jesus. A warden is not going to talk to a common inmate. He's not going to do that. If a warden were to do that, then there would be an effort among the inmates to try to get in front of the warden, because that then becomes the badge of honor. Right? The warden called me into his office today because he needed to consult with me. Right? So a warden isn't going to play those games. He's just not going to play those games. So Pilate is clearly not behaving like a warden. Why is he wasting his time with a common criminal? He's the Roman governor. He's the warden of Judea. Send the prisoner away and be done with it. So now Jesus responds, my kingdom does not belong to this world. In other words, yes, Pilate, I've preached a kingdom of good news where the blind see, the deaf hear, the paralyzed walk, the prisoners are set free, and eternal life is promised. That kind of kingdom I have preached, and I have inaugurated it, and the proof is in the miracles I have performed. And you have heard much about it. Pilate then asks his fourth question. Then you are a king. In other words, Pilate is saying, just show me, Jesus. Usher your reign now. Usher it in. Give me a sign. Remove my remaining doubts. Show me your kingship by assuming it now, and bring an end to this madness and confusion in which I live. The madness and confusion that is my life. So Jesus then responds, you say I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Jesus now refuses to let Pilate hide. You say that I'm a king, he says. But nowhere has Pilate said this. He's merely asked him, so you are a king. So Jesus is now reading Pilate's soul. Yes, Pilate, I came into the world, but I belong to another world. I didn't come to topple your world, but to point out another. If you want my world, my kingdom, you can have it, but you must surrender yours. I didn't come to take your kingdom away, but to offer you another, one that requires you to submit to it by surrendering yours. You must live in the truth that you already believe about me. It means that the mob outside that you're afraid of, that it means that you must stand up to them, even if it means you will lose your governorship by Caesar and maybe even your life. That's the cost, Pilate. I've come to take nothing away from you or from Caesar, but you must decide what you want, because you cannot live in two kingdoms. You yourself must freely surrender what is temporary to what is eternal, what is ultimately false to what is true. I offer you admittance into my kingdom, but you must decide to enter it. When Jesus says, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth," the line is drawn. And all of this gets compounded enormously when Pilate's wife now sends word at the very moment when Pilate is sitting on the judgment seat. So the judgment seat is every governor had one. When he sat on the seat, this is where he heard testimonies, he heard trials, he was the tribunal. And when he rendered a decision, when he enacted a law, when he gave an order, while sitting on the judgment seat, it was irreformable. Only Caesar himself could alter it. So Pilate seats himself on the seat, and he's about to render the judgment on Jesus. And then all of a sudden, it says, and so this is from Matthew, it's not from John. So John really doesn't include it. This is from Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Pilate knew who Jesus was. Luke tells us in his gospel that Pilate not only wanted to release him, but to acquit him altogether. This is in chapter 23, verse 16. "Therefore I shall have him flogged and then release him." Why? Why would Pilate want to acquit Jesus? Because he knows Jesus is the truth. Pilate declares 3 times in John that Jesus is innocent. Chapter 18, verse 38, chapter 19, verse 4, chapter 19, verse 6. And he seeks to release him instead of Barabbas. Chapter 18, verse 39. Pilate knows who and what Jesus is. He knows. But he is doing everything to keep from making a decision here. He's doing everything he can to avoid choosing that to which the evidence is pointing. And it is pointing to that he ought to make a complete surrender to the total lordship of Jesus. Make no mistake, friends, about what's going on here. This is not the trial of Jesus before Pilate. This is the trial of Pilate before Jesus. If you are not convinced by this point, just look at the actions on Pilate, right? So it begins in John 18, verse 28. Pilate receives Jesus as the prisoner. In the very next verse, he leaves to hear the charges of the Jews outside. 4 verses later, he comes back to the praetorium and questions Jesus the first time. 5 verses later, Pilate goes out to the Jews and declares he finds Jesus guilty of nothing. He comes back in and has Jesus scourged. 3 verses later, he brings Jesus out to show the Jews that very thing, that he's been scourged, he's been crowned with thorns, and he's got a purple cloak mocking him on him. The whole scene is a mockery of kingship. 5 verses later, he takes Jesus back inside and questions him a second time. And then, 3 verses later, he goes back out to the Jews and tries to obtain Jesus' release. The very next verse, he goes inside to bring out Jesus, and he does so, presenting him to the Jews and saying, "Behold your king." So in fact, at a certain point, right, and it's at this point that Pilate does something absolutely extraordinary, right? So this is John chapter 19, verse 13. This is where we're at. We're almost at the point where Pilate renders him to be crucified. And this is what John says. When Pilate heard these words, and the words are, "We have no king but Caesar," he brought Jesus out and seated him on the judge's bench in the place called the Stone Pavement, in Hebrew Gabbatha. He took Jesus and put him on the bench reserved for the governor. That's like a prison warden taking a prisoner, putting him in his chair and giving him his authority. It's like a judge at a murder trial taking the accused and putting him on the bench and saying, "Render your own judgment." I mean, it's absurd. But this is what Pilate has done. He is so avoiding, he's so desperately trying to avoid making a decision that he takes the accused and puts him in the governor's seat. When Pilate sat in that judgment seat, in the governor's seat, he ceased to be just plain old Pontius Pilate. He now represented the power and the authority of the Roman Empire itself. Any judgments he made from that seat would be binding. Right? And as I said, only Caesar himself could override such a judgment. Pilate doesn't want to make the decision. He wants Jesus to. Right? And Pilate, of course, topples. He just cannot surrender himself to the identity of Jesus. So what does he do? He orders the death, the execution of the eternal Word of God, the one he believes is the king prophesied in Daniel, the one who has brought in an ushering of the divine kingdom with evidence and goods, right? Jesus, if he's done nothing else, he's shown everybody the money, right? He's shown everybody the proof that he is who he says he is, that he is the long-awaited one. Right? So friends, the question Pilate tried to avoid is the question that Lent will not let us avoid. Jesus stands before every heart and asks gently but unmistakably, will you live in the truth that you already know, the truth about me? Because many Christians, most Christians, actually don't. Right? Pilate wanted neutrality. He wanted to keep his kingdom and sample Christ's. He wanted to be an observer of it. He wanted to control it, but not give up anything. Make it easy for me, Jesus. Remove the cost. But there is no safe place between two thrones. There is no lasting peace in a divided heart. And that's what Jesus revealed to Pilate himself. Every time Pilate walked in and out of the praetorium, he was rehearsing what we do when we stole. One step towards Jesus, one step back to the crowd, one step towards conscience, one step back towards comfort, one step towards obedience, one step towards disobedience. And that image of Pilate walking in and out of the praetorium to the crowd, that wrestle that you see that he's undergoing with this conscience. The image that I have when I look at that is if you remember the old cartoons like Tom and Jerry, where you had the mouse, running away from the cat. Yeah, the mouse running one way and the cat heads him off. Then he runs the other way, the cat heads him off again. And you see this kind of cat and mouse play. This is what is happening in Pilate's own soul. In the end, Pilate surrendered. but not to Christ. He surrendered to fear, falsehood, and failure. Lent is Christ bringing us to the judgment seat, not to condemn us, but to free us. And so his question to you is, who do you say that I am? The one who looks powerless in chains is the only king who can set prisoners free.